Unknown among scholars of Yiddish today, Chaim Margoles-Davidzon was a Polish-born Yiddish writer in the early 20th century in New York, whose political fiction critiqued the sins of Western society: fascism, racism, anti-Semitism, and capitalism, with illustrated collections of short stories, memoirs, and one-act plays. My talk today will guide us through his biography, then a brief history of New York-based Yiddish presses and publishing in the 1930s, and then dive into Margoles-Davidson's works and his personal archive, which I visited in YIVO, New York, to explore his orthographic, aesthetic, and material legacies. I'll be arguing overall that although Margoles-Davidzon left behind such a substantial and a diverse legacy, he was forgotten from the canon of Yiddish American literature for the very same reasons that he succeeded as a writer in the first place. In short, he was a sensational critic of Western society and a pro-Soviet activist. He made a name for himself among communists and writers of prose who have been doubly erased from the canon of American Yiddish literature. So, Margoles-Davidzon was born in Warsaw in 1891 to a soap maker and his pious wife. He learned religious and secular subjects as a child, and he chose sign painting as his professional trade as a young man, showing from a very early age an interest in the aesthetics of the written word. At age 21, he joined the army and left his home city behind. After serving on the Turkish front in World War I, he eventually landed in Tbilisi, where he helped to establish a Yiddish theater troupe. Sometime in his early life, Margoles-Davidzon lost a leg due to a lifelong illness, and he began navigating the world with a prosthetic limb. Here we see a few different portraits of him, as well as some doodles from his personal collection of himself as a bird. And just a heads up that anytime that you see that little blue YIVO symbol, it means that I took the photo at the YIVO archive in New York, and so it's courtesy of them. So in Tbilisi, Margoles-Davidzon met his wife, Jenny, and the couple had their first child, Louis. While Louis was still an infant, the family sailed from Constantinople to the United States to join Margoles-Davidson's parents, who already lived in New York. They arrived in 1921, and they made their home in the Bronx. They had their second child, Reuben, in 1927. Margoles-Davidzon worked as a typesetter for many years, honing his eye for print while also entering the publishing world as an author himself. Between 1935 and 1953, Margoles-Davidzon published 14 titles across many genres, including short stories, memoirs, an English to Yiddish translation, one-act plays, an autobiography, and a novel. In New York, during this era, Yiddish publishing and the press were intimately interlinked. So, of course, in addition to his books, Margoles-Davidzon found success writing for the Yiddish press. And this is where the bulk of our story will take place today. So when Margoles-Davidzon arrived in New York in 1921, he found himself sort of unknowingly at the precipice of a movement that would shape the post-war legacy of Yiddish literature: the ideological separation of writers and papers based on their stance towards Soviet communism. So immediately after his arrival in the United States, Margoles-Davidzon, under his new government name, Herman David's son with an S, he joined the American Communist Party. He quickly ingratiated himself into the active pro-Soviet Yiddish literary scene. As described by Gennady Estreich and others, the Yiddish communist literary movement in the United States grew rapidly after 1900. And by the mid-1930s, it was the strongest and largest body of pro-Soviet Yiddish writers operating outside of Russia. So in practice, this was due to targeted efforts by the Communist International to form Jewish sections of national communist parties. Like other countries' parties, the Jewish arm of the American Communist Party launched a pro-Soviet Yiddish periodical titled Der Emes, or The Truth, in the summer of 1921. Der Emes was the predecessor of the widely known daily paper, the Freiheit, or Freedom, which was established by Marxist literary critic Moshe Olgin in 1922, in April. So the establishment of these successive pro-Soviet papers marks the schism that defined Yiddish publishing for the rest of its golden era. As David Katz writes, In this era, Yiddish writers in New York coalesced around two self-identified camps: Die Linke, those on the left, and Die Rechte, those on the right. Both camps were socialist, but diverged in their support for the Soviet Union. Olgin ran the Freiheit as an arm of the pro-Soviet Yiddish movement, while editor Abe Kahan maintained the Forwart's staunch anti-communist stance, held since their founding in 1897. The Forwarts attracted writers of prose, including Sholem Asch, I.J. Singer, and Isaac Bashevis Singer, while the Freiheit had greater success with poets, including Moshe Leib Halpern, Hay Leivik, and Avram Rezen. In this era of segregation, the strike argues that the leftist sphere was, quote, created by its own cohort of writers who were kept apart from the non-communist literary circles. It was a strictly compartmentalized world, end quote. The process of compartmentalization involved excluding writers who were considered to be petit bourgeois and otherwise inauthentically representative of the working class. To this end, in 1929, Olgin established the Freiheit Writers Union, which within months became Prolet Pen, which was short for Proletarian Pen, the biggest Yiddish communist writers organization outside the Soviet Union. So as I previously mentioned, Margoles-Davidzon stood firmly on the left, publishing most of his stories and his memoirs in the Freiheit, as well as other leftist publications, including Hammer, the Monthly Signal, the Kovno-based Funken, the anthology Union Square, and Der Vorarbeiter. So the Linke prided themselves on including political perspectives in their publications. With the Freiheit and with Prolet Pen, Margoles-Davidzon published short stories about racism in the American South, about anti-Semitism in Hitler's Germany, and about labor justice in urban America. As you might have already noticed, Margoles-Davidzon believed deeply in the political power of aesthetics. We're going to take a look now inside some of his work, first through the lens of orthography. So for communist writers like Margoles-Davidzon, the printed word itself was charged with political potential. Following the standard orthography dictated by Soviet language authorities in the 1920s, many communist writers wrote in phonetic Yiddish, and after 1932, they dropped the final versions of Yiddish letters. Although Margoles-Davidzon did not follow Soviet orthography exactly, he wrote in phonetic Yiddish. He defended this decision in the 4-page long foreword of one of his books, saying, and this is my translation, I confess that I spell out the Hebrew elements of Yiddish, is because they are Yiddish. I maintain that when a word comes into a language and becomes a part of it, it needs to receive the same treatment and civil rights in that orthography as all other words in the language without signs of distinction. It's clear that every self-respecting language spells its adopted words according to its own laws and traditions, and not how they were spelled in the languages from which they were taken, especially when that makes it harder and more complicated for the reader to become fluent, end quote. So Margoles-Davidzon is living his values through his orthography. Notably, he uses terms of governance like civil rights and laws to discuss the Yiddish language. Even without our knowledge of his communist background, his orthography shows his dedication to equitable access to literacy and education for the betterment of working class culture. He argues that for Yiddish readers who also read English, for example, as his American audience would have, Hebrew is easily misinterpreted because the spelling system is not phonetic. Margoles-Davidzon knew his audience well, who in the mid-20th century were in a critical moment of linguistic and cultural uncertainty. Margoles-Davidzon advocated for Yiddish by making it accessible to the Jewish masses. And then I wanted to share these pages from the archive that I just thought were so fascinating. He literally just has lists of the Alef base written out in these different forms. I imagine he was speculating about how to harness the potential of each letter, but I would love to hear your thoughts if you have any ideas about what he was up to here. So moving on to his more general aesthetic and illustrative choices, maybe it was his training as a sign painter or his work as a typesetter that gave him a keen eye for design and an appreciation for powerful images. Either way, he always typed and photolithographed his own works, resulting in a product that exactly resembled his manuscript. As you can see from these two pages, Margoles-Davidzon carefully formatted each page in every book, even pages without illustrations, cutting and pasting words by hand when they didn't fit quite right. When Margoles-Davidzon had his second leg sadly amputated later in his life, he constructed a special apparatus of a board and a typewriter over his bed to keep himself writing and printing in his distinct way. Then here are a few more images from the archive that show components of Margoles-Davidzon's photolithography and typography obsession. One of these is the cover of one of his books with the illustration by a Lermansky. And then the other one is his signature nameplates with one of his signature typographies. So he would have stamped this onto all of his books, all of his published materials that you find sort of across the board. So let's talk about these illustrations. Because Margoles-Davidzon was not an illustrator himself, he had to rely on his community to achieve his perfect vision of each publication. The illustrations on these pages are most likely done by visual artist and frequent collaborator of Chaim Margoles-Davidzon's, Yud or Yasha Zeldin. Born in Vilna in 1902, Zeldin made his name as a writer, but he was also credited with illustrating his own work and the work of others. Of Margoles-Davidzon's 14 published books, Zeldin illustrated or co-illustrated half of them. And according to the Yiddish Writer's Lexicon, Zeldin lived in Moscow in the 1930s, voluntarily reported for the army in 1941, and he died in battle within a year. However, Zeldin's illustrations are featured in Margoles-Davidzon's works all the way up until 1947. So clearly, there's still research to be done in this area. Now, finally, let's talk about Margoles-Davidzon's material legacy, as told through his book committee ephemera. So out of his 14 books, 7 of them were published with support from the Davidzon Book Committee, who were a group of readers who crowdfunded his publications, usually in partnership with Perot Pen's imprint Signal. So the relationship that he had with his readers, who likely maintained the same political views as Margoles-Davidzon and fought for the same issues, this relationship was crucial to his success as a writer. He built trust with the committee, I imagine, by communicating with them regularly through these letters, these hand-signed copies of books, and even these fun marketing materials like the bookmarks, postcards, and coupons that you see here. This process was another opportunity to curate his authorial brand and make his work memorable. Margoles-Davidzon passed away in 1960 at age 69 due to his unknown lifelong illness. I'm hoping to determine soon if he remained a devoted communist until his death, or if the Stalinist violence of the 1940s and 50s impacted his beliefs significantly. There's just no way to know quite yet. But despite these strong political, aesthetic, and material legacies that I hope I've given you just a brief look at today, Margoles-Davidzon is currently invisible in the canon of American Yiddish literature. The 3 factors that allowed him to succeed subsequently left him in obscurity. The first is his alignment with Soviet communism. As we saw in his orthography, illustrations, and the themes of his writings, Margoles-Davidzon was an outspoken communist who literally painted his politics into his books. The Cold War obviously shunned communist thinkers from the spotlight in the United States, and Yiddish to English translators prioritized more mainstream thinkers, whose works were more likely agreed with the intended image of the Jewish American, not the Jewish Bolshevik. The second factor was his allegiance to Moshe Olgin and the pro-Soviet Yiddish press, concentrated around the Freiheit. In the post-war years of canonization, the Vorwärts emerged as the strongest voice representing Yiddish American writing. Its writers, including Sholem Asch, I.J. Singer, and Bashevis, found fame among Yiddish speakers and non-Yiddish speakers alike. And finally, the third factor is his chosen genre of dramatic prose. As the writings of Perot Penn-affiliated writers have re-entered the Yiddish literary canon, with great thanks to Amelia Glazer and David Weintraub, they focused on poetry primarily, which is what the Linke were known for. Because the Rechter were known for their prose, Chaim Margoles-Davidzon hasn't had the opportunity yet to be republished. So hopefully I've intrigued you enough to consider reading his work and maybe reinserting him into our canon. I'm excited to hear from this audience of experts, your thoughts and your questions about the presentation. And here is my contact information if anyone would like to get in touch, and I'll stop there.